This video is about a video by Contrapoints about Jordan Peterson, which was originally posted May 2nd, 2018. Contrapoints begins with some introduction of who Jordan Peterson is and what he does. Peterson is a psychology professor who teaches at University of Toronto. He first came to public notice for opposing a bill to amend the Charter of Human Rights here in Canada so that it would become illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of gender identity or gender expression. He also recently wrote a self-help book, 12 Rules for Life, which has become a bestseller. Contra begins her criticism of Peterson by recognizing that he has a great deal of talent as a public speaker and as a kind of life coach. The self-help story that he tells is a classic one, that life is suffering, that happiness is not enough to sustain us, and that we need a higher purpose. These may be basic insights, but Peterson's treatment has a way of making them seem fresh and urgent to his audience. That is particularly important because a good portion of his audience is young men, and we need to engage young men. As Contrapoint says,
most of Peterson's fans are young men, and someone has to whip the neckbeards into shape.
And that means, I suppose, not only that young men must be socialized, but that young men must be given a reason to buy into our shared social existence, because the alternative is violence. In that sense, Peterson is doing good work, and more power to him. But while Contra has no objection to the self-help stuff, there is a big problem.
And the problem is that all of this life coaching is basically just a Trojan horse for a reactionary political agenda.
Peterson advocates an ethic of self-help, not merely as a guide to private life, but as a replacement for progressive politics, which he characterizes as totalitarian and evil. Peterson does not always speak about progressive politics, because that doesn't sound scary enough.
His new, scarier word is postmodern neo-Marxism.
Contrapoints notes that this bears some similarity to the Nazi theory of cultural Marxism. Now, she states unequivocally that she does not believe that Peterson is a fascist, something that certain people on the left have said. But she asks this question.
If it's not a fascist conspiracy theory about Marxist intellectuals plotting to destroy the West, then what is postmodern neo-Marxism?
This question kind of stakes out the terms of the confrontation. For if it can be proved that postmodern neo-Marxism is not what Peterson thinks it is, or ultimately doesn't make sense, then we will have to reevaluate his efforts. At this point in the video, Contra gets into the bath and begins speaking to Peterson directly. I found this change from third-person description to second-person address interesting, because she begins to say a lot of really nice things about Peterson. She mentions things that she likes about him, and she mentions points in which she agrees with him. Most importantly, she concedes that many of the things that Peterson says about the academic left are correct. Professors deliver an education that only teaches students about oppression. Along with this comes a politics of resentment, a loathing of Western culture, and an atmosphere of political correctness in which even slightly different opinions are stifled. Contra mentions all of these points and grants that within a certain mediocre corner of academia, they are valid complaints. But Contrapoints thinks that Peterson could say all of this without comparing leftist activism to Stalinism. That's an overblown comparison, and a less intemperate person would have no trouble admitting that there's a great difference between them. So these are the 2 points of Contra's criticism that I want to focus on. 1. There is no comparison between the actions of progressive activists and those of Joseph Stalin, the 20th century's greatest mass murderer. 2. Peterson's characterization of the left as postmodern neo-Marxist doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make sense as a concept, because there's no connection between postmodernism and any version of Marxism, old or new. And in Peterson's telling, this progressive menace threatens what he calls the West. It is postmodern neo-Marxism versus the West. But that makes even less sense. Postmodernism is part of Western philosophy. Marxism is part of Western philosophy. And there is no part of social justice ideology that is meaningfully non-Western. From this point of view, it looks like Peterson's argument is falling apart. To begin my response, I should say that Contra's charge that Peterson harbors a reactionary political agenda is probably the worst supported claim she makes in the whole video. The way she expands on this is to say,
Peterson advocates an ethics of self-help not merely as a guide to private life, but as a replacement for progressive politics, which he characterizes as totalitarian and evil.
So, in her mind, I take it, to aim at replacing progressive politics with an ethic of self-help would be something reactionary. Now, the obvious thing to note is that this could easily sound quite positive. To anyone who does not identify as a progressive, and who recognizes all the problems with the left that Contra herself admits, the idea of replacing a politics of resentment with a sense of personal agency sounds wildly positive. If all the people on the left, preoccupied with issues of systemic bias, would turn their attention to the circumstances of their own lives where they have some realistic chance of making improvements, that would have to be a good thing. It would improve their lives, but it would also surely have positive political effects, because it would swell the ranks of the political center, giving the leading voices of the center more force. And not for nothing, it would rob unpleasant people on the right of easy targets, which progressives are always giving them. But even if you're unsure whether such a replacement would be wholly positive, it doesn't make sense to call it reactionary. That term is extreme. To imagine people making practical changes in their own lives, which would make them less inclined to join certain sorts of political demonstrations, because they considered them ineffectual or prompted by bad motivations, is not an extreme position. And in fact, I don't think Contra uses the word reactionary ever again in the remaining 24 minutes of the video. Now, I'm not incapable of imagining other ways of supporting that charge, that Peterson harbors a reactionary political agenda. But since Contra doesn't marshal those points to her argument, I'm going to leave them aside for now. Having conceded so many of the points that Peterson makes about the left, and about the intellectual and political atmosphere on college campuses, Contra's criticism really comes down to the way that Peterson frames the problem. This is a pretty narrow front, so I'll start by conceding what I can to her position. Yes, social justice ideology is not identical to Stalinism. Yes, postmodern neo-Marxism has the sound of something scary. And yes, it bears some similarity to the charge of cultural Marxism. Like cultural Marxism, it is the idea of a conspiracy to destroy Western culture, or a concerted effort to destroy Western culture. Contra mentions this similarity at 2 points during her video, and then quickly shunts it to one side, because she thinks that if she pursues it, people will think she's crazy. This discussion might go easier for me if I did the same thing, but to be fair to her, I don't think it sounds crazy. They do seem similar. I just don't think that the problem with the cultural Marxism thesis is assessed in her video at all, and the problem with it is not obvious to me. Okay, the Nazis promoted it, but the Nazis also promoted motherhood and outdoor activities. What do we really get from that information? I leave open that this view of things could be wrong or unbalanced, but since it doesn't immediately seem that way to me, I'll have to consider it more closely another time. For now, the questions are, should we be scared? And is postmodern neo-Marxism an appropriate term for what Peterson thinks we should be scared of? I will pursue these two questions for the remainder of the video.
Is it true that postmodern neo-Marxism is out to destroy us all?
At the beginning of her video, Contrapoints describes Peterson as,
he's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto who got famous for sounding the alarm about how protecting transgender people under Canadian human rights law shall surely lead to Stalinism.
Now, that's funny, but it's not exactly her most forthcoming representation of Peterson. Bill C-16 is, after all, something that many people read as mandating certain forms of speech. And it is a serious problem in a liberal society when some people can force others to say words or utter syllables that they don't mean under threat of legal penalty. It really doesn't matter what the words are. Change them to something that you don't mean and would hate to advocate for, and then imagine yourself in a situation where your property, livelihood, reputation, and freedom were all at risk if you didn't say what you were told to say. That sounds scary. Moreover, this change in the Charter of Human Rights, which added gender identity and gender expression to the list of protected characters, is based on poorly understood concepts. There is no settled public understanding of what gender expression covers or does not cover, and that means that we don't know how the coercive power of the law will be applied. And it's not strange that so much of this could be uncertain. Many of the issues which these terms are meant to cover only came into the mainstream of public discussion a few years ago. That makes the certainty of the advocates for this bill look suspicious. Nothing could be less clearly understood by the public at large, and yet there was certainty enough to push not just for ordinary legislation, but to a change in the fundamental Charter of Human Rights. Obviously, this issue deserves a far more detailed consideration than I'm giving it here. But that's just the point. This isn't a simple issue of protecting vulnerable people against unacceptable behavior. We have not thought through as a society what exactly it is that we are trying to protect. And we have not even begun to work out what behavior is unacceptable and what should be left to individuals to negotiate. Now, I don't say any of this to dismiss Contra's point about Stalinism, only to insist that Peterson's opposition to Bill C-16 had substantial motivations, and these were dismissed mainly by scoffing at him.
There's no comparison between Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Obviously, Contra's sarcasm here doesn't help. So, let's take another run at it. Is the left scary? Contra grants that many of Peterson's complaints against leftist university culture are valid.
But you know, I think that's a point that could probably be made without comparing transgender activism to Stalin.
That seems fair. So, why does Peterson make this comparison at all? Well, not for nothing, apparently. First, social justice is a political outlook based on groups, or identity classes. It treats individuals fundamentally as members of these identity classes, and some classes, in this vision of the world, bear political guilt, and others bear political virtue. And so there arises a political culture of championship and vilification. Championship for the allegedly oppressed, and vilification for their opposites. This is a recipe for hatred. Second, there is all the difference in the world between social change, which happens somehow, and the use of political levers to ensure social change. One is something hopeful, but very uncertain, and the other is authoritarian. Uncertain because, though you may want a certain kind of social change, how do you get it? People are unpredictable. Society is unpredictable. How do you raise consciousness or change minds in the way that you mean to? It may happen, or it may not. But legislation, by contrast, is relatively direct, and that is because it's coercive. Now, put a willingness to use the coercive power of the state together with notions of collective guilt, and you have a recipe for viciousness. People of this mindset quickly dispense with the institutional bulwarks which would prevent the appearance of a Stalin or a Committee of Public Safety. And roughly speaking, I think that's what Peterson meant by comparing the ideology of identity politics to Stalinism. It has this similar logic. Of course, Contra recognizes that Peterson gets some of this stuff right. In fact, she spends very little time attempting to disprove what he says. Rather, her defense is that the left just doesn't have the unity of purpose that Peterson ascribes to it. And the people who do think this way, that he complains about, are too small a group to be scary. Now, the feebleness of this defense bears a moment of consideration. Contrapoints doesn't say that the ideology of these people isn't dangerous, just that they're too small a group to be dangerous. For me, that admission speaks volumes about the reality of the situation. I will address the disunity of the left defense momentarily. For now, I want to focus on the defense that, while Peterson's complaints are valid, they are true only within a certain mediocre corner of academia.
But I think some of your criticisms of the left, the stifling of even slightly different opinions, the gratuitous loathing of Western cultural monuments, the politics of resentment, are, within a certain mediocre corner of academia, valid complaints.
Now, many people would dispute that social justice ideology is confined in this way, but to argue that would take me too far afield. My question is, supposing this were true, why is this confinement of the phenomenon not reassuring to us? First of all, reasoning that becomes common currency in higher education may drift and enter the social mainstream. That's a good thing, otherwise there would be no point to having universities. On the other hand, it means that even if social justice is presently confined to university campuses, we are merely cordoned off, not quarantined against it. Secondly, modern democratic republics are founded on reason, which makes the university, as the home of reason, a place of special importance to us. If universities are engaged in righteous fantasies, that could certainly weaken the conceptual basis of our political community. At a minimum, there is a connection between what is thought credible theoretically and the viability of our political regime. Thirdly, of all the disciplines, the humanities and the social studies are the most important for public life. Philosophy, history, political science, sociology, psychology, and disciplines of literature and language are the core of the university. And so the idea that this malignancy of thought is confined just to those disciplines
within a certain mediocre corner of academia
is the opposite of reassuring. It's a crisis, and I think Contrapoints needs to think more deeply about this. In addressing Contra's criticisms of some of Peterson's more hysterical-sounding claims, I asked two questions. First, should we be scared? And second, does postmodern neo-Marxism correctly name what Peterson is so concerned about? Contrapoints calls the entire idea of postmodern neo-Marxism into question, saying it's jumbled and nonsensical. Peterson seems to include under this term everyone from Marxists to liberal politicians, academic administrators to corporate HR departments, feminists, postmodern philosophers, and social justice warriors. This is, as Contrapoints concludes, the entirety of the modern left, to which Peterson ascribes a single ideology. Could this possibly be accurate? So the question becomes, what is postmodern neo-Marxism? Contrapoints pieces it together this way. Marxism is about economic class struggle, where the major distinction concerns who owns the means of production. Now, some university professors do subscribe to this view. On the other hand, 0 corporate HR departments do. So, even this half of the term doesn't capture the left the way Peterson thinks it does. On the other side, there is postmodernism. Now, this is an extremely vague and contested term. However, Contrapoints narrows it down quickly. Peterson is talking about postmodern philosophy, which is essentially skepticism about modern philosophy.
So what's modernism? What's what? What are words? What's anything?
Modern philosophy she characterizes by belief in science. It is important to understand that this means not just the physical sciences, but human and social sciences. Late modernist thought, in her telling, provides us with grand narratives about matters of human concern. Freud, Marx, and Weber all gave us such grand narratives. Peterson, too, in his book Maps of Meaning, gives us such a narrative. Postmodern philosophers regard such overarching narratives with extreme skepticism. As Jean-François Lyotard famously defined postmodernism, it is incredulity towards meta-narratives. So there's an obvious incompatibility between postmodernism and narrative-driven progressivism like, say, Marxism. Marxism conceives the human condition in economic terms. It is a meta-narrative in exactly the sense that Lyotard meant when he spoke of postmodern disbelief. Postmodernism breaks down narratives and identities and the stability of binary terms, like the Marxist pair, bourgeois and proletariat. So these outlooks conflict, and indeed there are fights between them, as Contra notes, between Marxists and identity politics activists, between identity politics activists and postmodernists, and, in the fullest example she gives, between liberal feminists and postmodern feminists.
Postmodern feminists want to show that the whole concept of womanhood, for instance, is contingent and potentially oppressive, and they think we should be working to destabilize and undermine it. And then the conventional feminist activists say, the fuck? We need the concept of womanhood to organize around women's political interests. How are we supposed to do that if we undermine and destabilize the concept of womanhood?
These are all good illustrations, and indeed, this is a good argument. But if it's worth criticizing someone's ideas, it's worth asking what they thought they meant. So, not what do these words mean, rigidly construed, but what did they mean in using this term? In this case, that is a very answerable question. The first thing to understand about Peterson's criticism is that the emphasis falls on neo-Marxism. The leading voices of the contingent that he's talking about are not postmodern philosophers, but proponents of social justice. It is these he calls neo-Marxists. Before moving on to talk about the connection with postmodernism, it makes sense to get straight why Peterson would use the term neo-Marxism. Certainly, these people are not Marxists. They are not focused on economic class. They are focused, nonetheless, on groups. Not classes of people distinguished by who owns the means of production, but classes of people with certain identities, which are distinguished in a childishly simple way by which are said to have power and which are said to be marginalized. So there are still classes which are essentially in conflict. Thus we have a new outlook on the old Marxist pattern. and these neo-Marxists are on the side of the disadvantaged, of the marginalized, of the disempowered, etc. In this light, Contra's show of perplexity about what Marxist professors and HR departments could possibly have in common seems a bit obtuse.
Some college professors definitely do believe that, but 0% of corporate HR departments do, so that... okay.
HR departments must give a sympathetic hearing to anyone with a grievance. But these days, how a grievance is assessed has a lot to do with the classes of the people involved. What are their identities in the scheme of social justice categories? Are they considered disadvantaged or privileged? Are they underrepresented or overrepresented? And to the degree that siding with the underprivileged term is baked into the institutional response, that is not really different from the social justice mindset that Peterson calls neo-Marxist. Anyway, that's the connection I see.
As a faculty of color, I need to address this issue.
Okay.
And I think you are taking a lot of space. First of all, as a minority
Hell
of
yeah.
color, as a faculty member of color, you personally addressed and challenged me at my office door saying, why didn't we as a union protect you when we did our best to defend you and address your concerns, and yet you come to a faculty member of color and charge her for not protecting your needs.
Now, what is the connection of this neo-Marxism with postmodern philosophy? It's quite a difficult question. There are several diverse connections, some quite contingent, and others more substantial. I'd like to start with an inessential connection, which seems to me, nonetheless, quite important. People flock to postmodernism because of its reputation. These critics apparently threatened the self-assurance of Enlightenment thinking, in terms of which the modern Western dispensation is justified. As such, they became a source of confidence, and to some extent an intellectual resource, from which any of modernity's discontented felt they could draw. The breakdown of narratives and identities represented by postmodernism is exactly what the discontented left needed to call into question the categories and understandings of liberal modernity. In this sense, it doesn't matter that the deepest tendencies of postmodernism are to dissolve our fixities, which is quite out of step with the rigid categories of progressive politics. The most important thing is the rhetorical force of postmodern skepticism against Western philosophy, something which all opponents of the modern West have wanted to draw on. For these people, postmodernism is not a condition, social or intellectual. It is simply a device for turning upside down on a rhetorical level anything they wish to oppose. I will add that while the alliance between these two camps has this opportunistic quality, some of the intellectual machinery of the French critics was quite well suited to the kind of assault that progressives had in mind. For example, the interpretation of institutions in terms of power has been a major industry in North American universities for 50 years. It spans the disciplines from sociology to legal theory to philosophy of science. Are these people Foucauldians or social justice warriors? Another favorite is the game of identifying the privileged term of any binary pair, and by this means calling that privileging into question. Are people who practice this kind of reading apprentices of Derrida or social justice theorists? My sense is that, unless your supper depends on telling the differences here, it all kind of looks and sounds the same. Their points of departure may be widely different, but their tendencies often look the same. However, inessential connections blend with more intimate ones. Social justice warriors may not have needed an attack on philosophical modernity as a whole, but in some of their targets, they were of one mind with the postmodernists. For example, both sought to undermine the ideal of the rational, autonomous, individual subject, something central in modern philosophy and in Peterson's thought too. Postmodernists attacked the transcendental subject of Western philosophy, while Marxists attacked the rights-bearing, property-holding subject. One may have had more to do with theoretical doubts, and the other more to do with a sense of liberal modernity's injustice, but the target of their criticism was the same. All of the connections I've described so far leave these two camps separate from one another, doing their own activities. And it's legitimate to wonder whether anyone who is committed to one of these positions could genuinely come to adopt the outlook of the other one. How does one get from the utter relativism of postmodern critique to the righteousness of social justice ideology? I'm going to give two speculative answers to that question, which may best serve to explain why Peterson links them together. Perhaps the most important traffic between these two camps passes through the idea of arbitrary power. Postmodernism is essentially a skepticism, not just of Enlightenment ideals and narratives, but of rationality itself. Thus, postmodern skepticism goes together with a relativistic and essentially anti-rational conception of knowledge. In the writings of Michel Foucault, who gave this view its most influential expression, knowledge claims are cut off from the capacity to verify them, justify them, or in any way rationally assess them. Rather, they are viewed as relative to a set of social institutional practices, which are themselves produced and sustained by certain dispositions of power. And this idea the social justice types picked up on. However, those dispositions of power cannot be justified, because there is no basis in the postmodern repertoire on which they could be justified. And because we are incapable of viewing dispositions of power neutrally or indifferently, power that is not justified comes to be viewed inevitably as something unjust. And that provokes moral indignation and political radicalism. It is by something like this chain of inferences that we arrive at that synthesis of postmodern relativism and social justice righteousness, which is otherwise so paradoxical. And while I offer that as a speculative reconstruction, it is the easiest thing in the world to find some young person with a degree in sociology or some activist discipline who will argue that rationality has been a tool used by those in power to justify their own power. After 4 years of study, it's practically the only thing these students know. My other answer to the question of how we get from postmodern relativism to the righteousness of social justice goes in a different direction. All of the points I've made so far have dealt with the attraction of postmodernism to progressives. But there is at least one great practical reason why progressive social justice might be attractive to postmodern types. Those who follow out the postmodern critique of Western philosophy find that they are left, in the end, without any positive vision. That kind of result is generally not tenable, hard-won though it may be. Few people can live in a state of disbelief or non-commitment. We want some orientation. Students of postmodernism are left grasping for something, anything to actually make sense of life. And here, the leftist program of social justice seems to supply the deficiency. In hazarding that explanation, I admit that it looks like there should be some sort of insuperable opposition between postmodern critique and notions of social justice. But what we find in fact is that people who traffic in postmodern lines of argument often arrive at left-leaning moral imperatives, and we have to wonder how this happens. It may be that people of this description were, more often than not, only playing at postmodern doubt, and that really their wish had always been to make the world a better place. Or perhaps, having arrived at philosophical zero, the claims of solidarity strike the mind with an unrivaled plausibility, as the only human good that kind of speaks for itself. Peterson addresses this same puzzle and also hazards an explanation of this type, saying that postmodernists, left with nothing by their own philosophical account, snuck Marxism in the back door. I've listened to several people on YouTube who criticize the shoddiness of this explanation, and perhaps it's not something that Peterson knows a great deal about. But that there is something that needs explaining here is obvious. Foucault and Derrida, to start with, were both at home on the left. How did that happen? How does radical skepticism about reason, truth, and logos dovetail with progressive causes? But then, beyond the big names, and far more importantly, there are all the nameless, second-rate academic social theorists who draw on postmodernism as if from first principles, but whose writings are put forward to justify some cockeyed idea of social justice. Now it may be that all these explanations are just too heterogeneous to be persuasive. Certainly, they lack the convincingness of closely studied individual examples based on text. However, as I've said, clearly something here needs explaining. The confluence of sympathies between the illiberal left and the postmodern-inspired professoriate is just too obvious a phenomenon to miss.
And Nicholas, this is where I want to bring you into the discussion because you teach this.
Basically, it's not correct that there is such a thing as biological sex. Pronouns are actually part of a cisnormative culture. Cisnormative is basically the very popular idea and assumption that there is such a thing as male and female, sometimes also referred to as a gender binary. But cisnormativity is basically that everyone assumes that there is male and female.
Your view would be it's much more complicated than that.
Right, it's not my view. I just know that for over 50 years, scientists have shown that that's not true.
There is one last facet of Contra's criticism of Peterson's political outlook, which I have not addressed.
So I've argued that Peterson is invoking the incoherent concept of postmodern neo-Marxism as the supervillain in a childishly simple worldview he's promoting, where these evil leftists are out to destroy the West. Now, it's time to inspect the other side of this coin. What, exactly, is the West?
Peterson views postmodern neo-Marxism not just as a brand of politics which he does not share, but as a threat to something of ours, something which he calls the West. For Contrapoints, this way of framing the intellectual and social situation makes no sense at all. She points out that the actual tradition of Western thought subverts this opposition. It's quite straightforward. Marxism is part of Western philosophy. Postmodernism arose within Western philosophy. And social justice ideology is a phenomenon of the West. These points are undeniable, so we have to ask, what could Peterson possibly have meant? Unfortunately, just as the contradictoriness of Peterson's language here is right on the surface, this objection does not attempt to penetrate that surface. Indeed, it rests on the most unimaginative reading of this idea of the West, and constitutes chiefly a refusal to think about what Peterson means. Obviously, you can claim that these criticisms and theorizations which Peterson condemns as postmodern neo-Marxism, belong to the West, and you can deny, therefore, that it makes any sense to worry about some supposed threat to the West. But if you want to understand why Peterson says what he says, and why he uses these terms to describe the problem, the answer is not far to seek. There is, within the broader tradition of Western thought, something we can call the effective West. The effective West is based on the thought of people like John Locke, Adam Smith, and the authors of the Federalist Papers. This is the West of liberalism and democracy, of property and the rule of law, of the individual and natural rights, to free speech, to free association, to free trade, and so on. Against this, there is also a West of discontent, which lampoons the effective West as bourgeois. I am not arguing that the West of discontent is unimportant. Herbert Marcuse, Michel Foucault, and Stokely Carmichael are not unimportant, let alone Marx. I am only saying that the ideas which we have put into practice and held to successfully over time have some right to be considered what defines us. At least, that is pretty much the way Peterson uses the term the West. I don't know why this doesn't strike Contrapoints as a viable reading. She pretty much trips right over the idea, listing capitalism and individualism under the heading of the West, arrayed against authoritarian collectivism under the heading of postmodern neo-Marxism. Her protest seems to be that this framing of a conflict of ideas in terms of geographical chauvinism and external threat is inaccurate and scaremongering. But if she doesn't like using the term the West for this phenomenon, she can choose a different term. I'd like to hear what it is. But the distinction between the effective West and the ideas that are inimical to it will remain, and so the meaning of her term will remain substantially the same as Peterson's the West. Ultimately, Peterson's concern is not, as Contrapoints makes out, with preserving the geographical boundaries of the intellectual tradition. It is with preserving the intellectual scaffolding and political commitments which have made the West what it is in reality. Okay everyone, that is the end of my first video. There was a lot from Contra's video that I had to leave out because this argument was getting too long. There was a whole segment from the end of her video on Peterson's rhetoric and the example of the lobster, along with some other great examples, which I hope to cover in a later video. For now, since this is a new channel, your feedback means a lot. Please comment, like, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.